Mark Vipple, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
So I guess my first question, is Meta out of the open source game, Vipple?
Well, they haven't released the open model since Llama 4, but and they released the new model yesterday, which is available on meta.ai. No announcements around open source models recently. We've heard some chatter that they are still actively thinking about that, but I have no more news.
Well, I just asked because you used it, but this was a major bedrock, I think, of the open source AI for a while and kind of disappeared, and now their newest entrant is not open source?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I think Meta is really trying to figure out what their strategy is around AI, and really they don't really have any obligation to publish their models as open source. I would say what's happening in the open source world is that if somebody stops building open models, there is a huge gap there, which because there is this incredible demand for open custom models, and that gets filled by somebody else. And so I would say in the last 6 months, you actually have much stronger open models in terms of the sort of the collection of open models that exist.
Because I was going to ask, is there any hope for open source?
There's a huge hope.
There's hope. I mean, these guys, Anthropic, OpenAI, Google, their budgets are insane. How could you ever hope to compete?
Well, the story of Mozilla was actually that 25 years ago, right? Is there any hope of there being an internet web browser?
How many people use Firefox?
But at the time,
what's Firefox's market share right now?
But the story isn't that. Is that we took Internet Explorer off of its horse. And I mean, the joke about Firefox is, what's the best version ever? Internet Explorer 7 or Chrome. It was a delivery mechanism for web standards being popularized with developers. And Microsoft lost to Linux, it lost to Firefox, it lost to MySQL, it lost to Apache, and the numbers.
You say lost, but they're still a $4 trillion company.
Yeah, but they didn't own the web market. They had to become an open source company. That's what Azure is.
Okay, what do you think, Vipul?
I think that I think open source adoption is massive in the same period. We went from altogether serving 10 billion tokens a day last year. This is early 2025. Now serving over 5 trillion tokens a day.
Say that one more time. I didn't hear you.
Serving over 5 trillion tokens a day on open source models. So there is a 3 orders of magnitude growth that we've seen just on our platform. And
how does that compare to one of the bigger closed models? How many tokens is OpenAI doing on a daily basis?
I don't know the exact numbers, but it is becoming a substantial portion of the tokens served. And
if you had to guess, ballpark, percentage-wise, what proportion?
I think there was a tweet recently from OpenAI that their new model had hit 5 trillion tokens a day. So I imagine it's much bigger. Maybe it's like 90%, 10% distribution.
Okay.
But the other effect is that open models are now really being used as base models for building custom models. So companies like Cursor and Cognition, many of these are our customers. They are taking these open models and really putting their own data, which they are collecting from interactions with their applications, to train custom models that are much more, tuned for their use cases and have an incredibly better price performance. Right? It's like 10 times better price performance. So as AI becomes a real spend for companies, because they are getting value and it's deployed throughout the organization, has become part of in some ways the digital labor force. I think you will see this movement towards using open models and using custom models, because you can control them and you have significantly better economics.
What does it look like today for a company? Is it we're spending a lot of money on Claude because we're just replacing our software engineers? Or how are they using closed models and supplementing with what you can provide?
Many of our customers use both. I would say they're pretty complementary, pretty complementary sort of products in the market. With closed models, you get this sort of frontier 6 months before it becomes available as a broader capability in open models. And generally, like if you look at the benchmark trends, you see this sort of convergence happening in these benchmarks over time. And there is value in both. There's value in the sort of, the frontier intelligence that you can buy today to do more complex tasks that you couldn't otherwise do, to the broader intelligence that's just sort of deployed across, across different kinds of tasks across the company. And our prediction is that this broader intelligence is what will become, in some ways, the higher token count relative to the frontiers of intelligence, which will always remain important, because I think you're seeing that scaling laws continue to work, and we will have better and better models. But the commoditization of this technology is quite important.
And if you don't have to be, sorry, go ahead.
And
Mark.
I think that the other thing, just in terms of us using it, but then what we see in startups is a lot of times that frontier and that general purpose model is really good, like Claude Code, for prototyping something. But once you know what you need to build, or once you've kind of figured out the thing, then training that small model, getting that thing that runs cheaper, all of that stuff in production, you can totally go to open source. And that, I think the key piece that people often don't realize is, as has been in the past, and what you're saying is that open source is really actually raw material. So I prototype this thing, and bake the cake for the prototype of the cake with Claude Code. And then once I know what I need to do, I go to somebody like Umi, who's a startup here, and I, post-train, or I, fine-tune the model. And then I've got something more compact, more accurate, more specific to what I prototyped, and I can run it more cheaply.
When it comes to OpenAI versus Anthropic, which one gets to IPO first, and which is going to be more successful?
I don't know who will get there first.
I want like a 10-word, like a very quick answer. Just
Anthropic will get there second, but OpenAI will fail.
Okay, we'll unpack that. What's your guess?
Hard to say. I would say they will likely get public pretty close to each other, because access to better cost of capital for infrastructure scale is pretty important. And I don't think so. I'm sure this is like I'm just speculating, but I would imagine this is a competitive vector for the companies to be public pretty close to each other.
You think OpenAI is going to fail, Mark? Why?
I think in the long run, I don't see how they differentiate. I mean, what you've seen, a lot of the success with Claude and Anthropic is technical innovation. I mean, what's happened with Mythos in the last few days is amazing. But the other thing is they've really positioned themselves as being about safety, being trusted. And this technology is commoditizing. That 6 months lead, even if the model is amazing, isn't in the long run going to be the deciding factor.
What is the deciding factor?
I think it's going to be brand and differentiation. And I don't see how, in this world of open source, where OpenAI is heading anywhere to differentiate themselves. All this stuff is commoditizing. It's either going to be made by Google or made by Microsoft or open source. And I don't know that they're going to be around. I think they're going to be the Sun Microsystems of this era.
OpenAI will, or made by Anthropic. They'll survive.
I think Anthropic has a path to surviving because they have got a different positioning they're going after.
Okay. Speaking of IPOs, when are you going public?
No plans yet. But, again, I think we build services that are underneath the services is large amounts of infrastructure. It's in hundreds of megawatts today. It's going to be in gigawatts in the coming 5 years. And there are definitely a lot of advantages for a company like Together to be a public company.
Okay. Chinese models. We didn't mention those. We've talked about the winners and
mentioned
losers.
them below the surface because people are using them.
How much are they using them, and how can the United States compete?
Well, you can answer that
In
how much
open
they're using
source.
them because you see.
I mean, I think the recent set of models are very, very good, right? So they are.
What's your favorite?
Um, I would say they're different sort of. They're architecturally a bit different from each other. So they sort of all in some ways sit on this Pareto of price, performance, quality. The Kimi models are great. The Minimax model is very efficient. It's fantastic. The GLM models are good. The DeepSeek models are good. There's a uh, people are building on Llama's Maverick and Scout models as well. And so I would say one of the interesting things is that um, all these companies are publishing models, but they're also publishing papers and architectural innovations, which are in fact being pulled into the closed source world, and it's really sort of moving the field forward in terms of how to build. And they're quite focused on efficiency and from making model architecture changes that are designed for serving models more efficiently.
Why are they doing so much better than? I mean, what are the open source competitors, the best open source competitors to the Chinese that are out there, and why are the Chinese so far ahead?
I would say I think they're ahead, right? They are ahead by
unquestionably, yeah.
There is just that ecosystem developed in where the fact that the model is closed or open doesn't matter as much, and the game theory of that ecosystem is that people are building better models. They all happen to be open versus closed, and that has sort of resulted in sort of domination of open source, current domination of open source by Chinese models. But I think there are lots of efforts in the US. NVIDIA is building Nemotron models. Definitely a very well capitalized company that is extremely focused on building an open source ecosystem. You have startups like Reflection and RC who are much more seriously building open source models as independent companies. You have Mistral, and I think we'll see more participants here.
Is it strategic?
And I think it was interesting to see that when they announced the Nemotron models that NVIDIA put out, and I think that's a real attempt to make sure there is a non-Chinese set of open source models that are going to be, there's no way they're not going to catch up. But what was less covered was they announced an alliance around Nemotron with Mistral and Savram, which is Indian, and Sakana, which is Japanese. And so you actually see a bunch of the sort of Western model makers kind of coming together potentially under that in terms of where the open source stack goes. And that's how things have worked in the past, right? So I think it's not to look at one company or one model, but where's the industry going? Where's the stack going? And I think just because, frankly, the early innovations that came from OpenAI, came here, were a company run by somebody who came from the venture scene from Y Combinator, even though the research was open research, there was a kind of tendency to build these very typical blitzscaling companies. But underlying infrastructure, raw material, tends to commoditize, tends to go open source. So China, I think, is just at the front edge of that. And I think that'll happen here.
Why does it matter strategically for the West to catch up? Does it?
Well, I think what happened in the web era, if you look at where Microsoft really lost, is that everybody moved on to open source or the web, right? Facebook was built on the web. Everything that we've built since then has been built on the Linux stack. And so it is likely that much of industry moves on to open source AI. And I don't want that to be all Chinese infrastructure. So if what you want to do is shape the direction and monetize the direction of the underlying infrastructure, and people will build businesses around that. You are.
Yeah.
Is there enough money in the world to keep these growth curves going at their present slope?
The growth curves of users, growth curves of money being thrown into an incinerator.
So Anthropic is struggling with, how much compute do we build? Are we going to overshoot? Or are we going to undershoot? And now it seems like they undershot and they're struggling. Tell me, like, what is the problem they're facing, and how do they solve it?
I think it's really difficult to do capacity planning on a piece of technology that improves in a way that you can't quite predict what the downstream applications of this will be, and I think it's just very hard to go put all this capital into the ground without understanding these growth curves. So I think the constant state of, I believe that the models have become better at this point than in terms of usefulness. They're growing faster than the supply chains on the data center and chip side, which means you will constantly be in this sort of state of figuring out how to ration your AI and how to make it more efficient, because there's just so much demand for it. I think what your question is a really interesting one. Is there enough capital in the world? And the answer to that has to be, is AI going to create enough efficiency to create that? I think you're starting to get to that point where the direct effect of use of AI has to create enough value to continue to fund these large-scale investments.
And are you starting?
There's also a question of, will it just become a lot less capital intensive over what time period? Because we don't necessarily have this architecture of AI forever. It's a very capital intensive or energy intensive architecture. We don't necessarily have these chip architectures forever. I mean,
what's the alternate architecture you envision?
Well, I think there's lots of people who are playing with different approaches to AI, whether that's going back to symbolic AI or combining things that are more traditional databases with AI. But I think then people are looking at energy efficiency. People are looking at lots of ways for this to be less capital intensive. And I think there's a huge incentive in the market to figure that out. So one's going to be to get ROI, but the other is going to be to make it cheaper and more efficient.
I got to ask you while I got you, Mark, why do I need an open source browser in the AI world?
Why do you need an open source browser? Well, the reason
why can't I just use Chrome? Gemini's great, right?
Well, though that's actually the answer on why you need Firefox. I think why you need to open source anything is so you can trust it, so that somebody can go in and look at it and audit it. Chrome, though, is also an open source browser. That's not the differentiator. The differentiator between Firefox and Chrome is we're not just shilling or not pushing one thing down your throat. As we roll out AI into Firefox, you can get Gemini, but you'll also be able to get open models. You'll also be able to integrate stuff from, roll your own or bring something local. So a key piece of, what open source offers, which is also what we offer all the way through the consumer product, is choice, flexibility, the ability to configure things. So if you don't want that, we're the wrong product.
All right. We're already out of time. That was really fast. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.